It started with a marble, just one, rolling out from under the basement steps while my mom was doing laundry. She swore nothing was there, but I knew better. When I was 5, we moved into an old Philadelphia row home, the kind with creaking floorboards, shadowy corners, and that eerie, cold feeling you can't shake. I hated it. But then, I met Thomas. He was my age, and we'd play jacks and marbles under the basement steps. My mom thought I was talking about my stepdad, also named Thomas. But no, this Thomas stayed in the basement. Always. One day while grabbing my school uniform, I saw him again, peering through the gaps in the stairs. His face was twisted with anger, tears streaking down. "I just want to go out and play," he sobbed. I begged my mom to let him out, but she didn't understand. Years passed. I outgrew the basement and Thomas, until my younger brother, also named Thomas, started talking about his imaginary friends. One of them, you guessed it, was Thomas. But unlike George and Johnny, who played everywhere, Thomas stayed in the basement. Then came the morning my mom swore she saw my brother walking up the basement stairs, buttoning his uniform. But minutes later, all my brothers came down from their bedroom. None of them had been in the basement. The last time anyone saw him, my mom was doing laundry. She caught a glimpse of a little boy, no older than 5, in dusty overalls, light brown hair, and blue eyes. She froze as he turned, translucent in the sunlight. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I just want to go out and play," he said before walking out the back door. He never came back. But sometimes, in the quiet of the house, you'd still hear the faint clink of marbles rolling across the floor. Paul was one of my closest friends growing up, the kind of friend you spend every weekend with, swapping stories and playing dumb pranks. But Paul's house was different. It wasn't just old. It felt alive. Over 100 years of history, creaking wood, and a suffocating sense of something watching. Everyone in Paul's family had stories about the house. His sisters, his parents, even Paul himself. They all swore it was haunted. I never believed it. Not really. I thought it was all in their heads. That was until I stayed there. It was during high school. My parents went out of town, so I stayed at Paul's place for a few nights. I slept in his room, on the floor in a sleeping bag, while he took the bed. The first night was uneventful, quiet even, but the second night, I woke up suddenly. Something had pulled me out of my sleep, and I didn't know what it was. Then I heard it, a whisper, so soft, so close it felt like it was right inside my ear. "My name. You need to leave. Now." I froze. The voice wasn't angry or threatening. It sounded like a warning. My first thought was Paul. He was always messing around, and I figured this was another one of his pranks. I turned to my right, where his bed was, but he was out cold, completely still, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. "Paul?" I whispered, half hoping he'd laugh and say he got me. But he didn't move. He was dead asleep. That's when it hit me. The whisper, it had come from my left ear. Paul was on my right. The room was so quiet it was deafening. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Paul laughed it off. "Yeah, weird stuff happens here sometimes," he said casually, like he was talking about bad weather. He told me more about his experiences in that room, about the demons he'd see during sleep paralysis, how his standing fan would turn into the shape of a girl, how he'd wake up punching it to the floor. He mentioned seeing figures in his closet, shadows that didn't belong, things that shouldn't be there. And his wasn't the only room in that house. Paul's sister swore she'd seen a little boy in their bathroom, staring at her with empty eyes. Their mom once opened her closet to find the same boy standing there, looking up at her. He only said 4 words: "I want my mom." I used to think Paul's stories were just that, stories, until other people who didn't believe in any of it, started experiencing things too. One of our friends was taking care of Paul's dogs while the family was out of town. She was alone in the house, feeding the dogs in the kitchen. Suddenly she heard a scream, a blood-curdling shriek coming from the living room. She grabbed the dogs and bolted outside. When she called Paul, he just laughed. "Yeah, that happens sometimes," he said, like it was no big deal. Another time, a friend who thought all of us were full of crap went upstairs during a party to grab a drink. He was sober, totally clear-headed. As he walked through the dining room, he glanced out the window onto the porch. A woman was standing there. She was tall, with a grim, featureless face, just staring into the house. He looked away for a split second, but when he turned back, she was gone. When he told Paul about it later, Paul just nodded. "We've all seen her," he said. The basement was the worst. It was cluttered, dark, and felt like it stretched on forever. One summer, Paul's family decided to clean it out. In the far corner, hidden behind piles of junk, they found a storage closet no one seemed to remember. Inside was a vintage music box, the kind with a little spinning ballerina. They left it there. But a few days later, when Paul and another friend were cleaning, the music box started playing, by itself, from inside the closed closet. They ran upstairs and didn't go back down for days. But the story that chills me the most? Paul's older sister once had a dream, a vivid, terrifying dream that she was being exorcised. She could feel the demon clawing its way out of her body as priests surrounded her, shouting verses, holding her down. The moment she woke up, drenched in sweat, the rosary hanging on her wall flew across the room and shattered. No one else was there. Paul moved out years ago. He says his sleep paralysis stopped as soon as he left. But sometimes, when I think back to that house, I can still hear the whisper in my ear. "You need to leave. Now." It was a warm, breezy night in Mexico when my brothers and I were staying with my grandparents. Their house was isolated, surrounded by undeveloped land, the kind of place where the darkness pressed against the edges of the light from the street lamp. We were sitting outside under that very light, my grandparents, my aunt, and us kids, watching TV set up on the windowsill. Everything felt peaceful until the dogs started barking. First, just a few. Then a chorus erupted. It was like every dog in the neighborhood had gone mad. Their barking grew closer, swelling into a deafening roar. My grandfather, a tough man, grabbed his shotgun and stood to face whatever was coming. But then, the dogs appeared, dozens of them, filling the street, snarling and howling. But they weren't just barking randomly. No, they were focused on something, or someone. In the center of the chaos, the dogs snapped and lunged at what seemed to be a woman. But no matter how they tried, they couldn't touch her. Each attempt ended with the dogs yelping and retreating. Then we saw it. Her. She floated a foot above the ground, her legs moving as though walking, but never touching the dirt. Her dress trailed behind her, tattered and translucent, like smoke. Her face. She had no face. It was flat and featureless, but I couldn't look away. Her presence radiated something unnatural, something wrong. My grandfather, who'd been so confident, lowered his shotgun and muttered, "This is of no use here. This one's on you," as he handed the moment to my grandmother. My grandmother grabbed her Bible and began praying loudly, her voice trembling but unwavering. The dogs scattered. One by one, they fled into the shadows, but the woman kept coming closer. My aunt screamed at us to look away, but I couldn't. Her feet were ghostly, her hair floating as though underwater. When she reached my grandmother, I heard it, a bone-chilling wail that pierced the night. My grandmother didn't flinch. She confronted the entity, her voice firm as she recited prayers. The woman screamed again, louder this time, before turning and vanishing into the darkness, floating over a drainage canal like smoke carried by the wind. My grandmother walked back, calm, and simply said, "She won't be back." But I've never been able to forget her. The way she moved, the faceless void where her features should have been. It still haunts my dreams. I was 11 when it started. Whispers. They came from the corner of my room. At first I thought I was imagining it, but they were persistent, soft but distinct. One night curiosity got the better of me, and I whispered back. "Who are you?" I asked. The voice answered, a little girl named Mary. She said she was a ghost. I don't know what I was thinking, but one day, I asked her to show herself. "Can I see you?" I whispered. The room grew colder, and then I heard her voice, clear as day. "Yes." I felt the air shift as a purple mist began forming in the corner of my room. My heart was pounding as it twisted and grew. I froze as the mist moved toward me, down the hall, stopping by the living room wall. It morphed, twisting into the shadowy silhouette of a little girl. I ran out of the house calling my mom in sheer panic, but it didn't stop there. The shadow followed me, first to the office where my mom worked, then into her bathroom, and even back home. It tugged at my hair, always hovering just at the edge of my vision. The next day, I stood in my room and screamed at it, demanding it leave me alone. And just like that, it was gone. But that shadow, that mist, it felt alive, like it wanted something from me. To this day, I don't know what it was, or what it could have been if I hadn't forced it to leave. I was 3 the first time I saw him. The Purple Man. He wasn't like anything else. A tiny silhouette of a man, purple in color, wearing a coat and hat. He didn't have a face, but he wasn't scary to me, at least not at first. He danced and played around my room while I watched from my bed. Then, just before he disappeared, he waved at me. Years went by, and I never thought about him again, until my own son turned 3. One afternoon, he napped in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house. When I went to wake him, his face was pale. He told me he'd seen a little purple man. My stomach dropped. I hadn't mentioned the Purple Man to anyone, but my son described him perfectly. The coat, the hat, the way he moved. And it didn't stop there. A few days later, he told my mom about a smiling man sitting next to her on the couch. But there was no one there. Now, my daughter is 3. Every time I see her glance at a corner or whisper to herself, I hold my breath, waiting for her to see him too. Because if he comes back, what does he want? And why does he never stay gone for good?